So this is a short video to help you with your English language lesson for Friday the 27th. Um, I'm showing you on screen now the English language booklet that many of you will have that you picked up from school. If you don't have the booklet, you can download everything in it from Show My Homework, so don't worry too much. And you can attempt the lesson today without the booklet. But I just wanted to remind you of some of the things here. So on the front of the booklet, there's a reminder of some of the important skills that you must try and use when you complete uh, writing tasks for paper 2, so writing to present point of view. And the couple to draw your attention to. So here, this is a clearly identifiable argument. You have to remember that your job is not necessarily to provide balance and do a balanced argument. You need to stick to a point of view and develop an argument throughout the whole of your piece. Your job is not to, say some people think this and some people think that. The end. You should show that you can create an argument over a page and a half or 2 pages where you build your points logically in connected paragraphs and actually show that you've thought about what you believe. A couple of other things here that people sometimes struggle with. Ideas have to be developed. That means that if you give a suggestion when you're making an argument, you need reasons, you need examples. And if you sort of explain why you think something should happen, you need to outline why that would be a good idea. I find a lot of students writing their arguments sometimes say something they believe in, but don't necessarily develop that idea. And finally, some people can be a little bit confused about what a linguistic device might mean. And that just means you've got to tailor your language to suit the audience and the purpose, and try and use certain devices such as alliteration or repetition effectively, not just chucking them in whether you feel like they should be used, but really thinking about your language. A couple of other things in the booklet. The front, you've got principles of planning, a brief overview of the styles of writing you must attempt, and you've got a list of devices and techniques that you might attempt in your writing, some discourse markers that can help you organize and connect sentences and paragraphs, and then some useful vocabulary, which we'll return to in a bit. So I'm just going to switch to PowerPoint here and talk you through the lesson. Okay, so if you don't have the booklet, that's not essential. You will see on the slides later that I'm going to talk through the actual task, so there'd be nothing wrong with writing down the task and doing all your work on paper. You do need something to write with and access to these slides and hopefully access to the YouTube clip as well. We're looking at paper 2 writing tasks, writing to present our perspectives and ideas, and hopefully by the end of the lesson, remember this is only a 50-minute lesson, you'll have thought about the task, planned your piece, and hopefully started writing it. And that writing is something that you may wish to complete at a later date. Okay, so here is your task. So I'm going to give you, I would suggest you pause in a moment. I want you to read it. And the first thing I want you to do on your first reading of this task, and if you've got it in front of you, you can highlight and annotate it, is make sure you're completely clear on the audience, who you are writing or speaking to, the purpose, what you're being asked to do, and the form of your writing. Form would be, is it an article, is it a letter, is it an essay, etc. So pause the video and make sure you're confident with those. Okay, so hopefully you've noticed that you're writing a letter, and your job is to argue your point of view on this statement. And this statement is clearly about the environment and how we might take better care of the environment. Now, you're being asked to write to the Minister for the Environment. So this means you're being asked to write to a politician, someone who's been elected, someone who's works for the government. So that should give you some guidance on how you should phrase your letter and the type of style you might adopt. Of course, you're writing to an elected politician, so you shouldn't be really chatty and colloquial and friendly. But just because you're writing to a politician, that doesn't mean you can't be creative, you can't use humour, you can't be sarcastic or vary your tone or even be angry at some point. Now, I want you to do a second reading of this, and especially if you have your booklet in front of you, spend some time annotating. There is a long statement here. Quite often the statements are quite long with these persuasive writing tasks, and your job isn't necessarily to cover everything in the statement, but you need to pick out certain bits that you might discuss in your writing. So pause and have a think, maybe make a bullet point list or a mind map or annotate the question. What do you think you actually might write about? Okay, so I'm going to give you some potential ideas that I'm sure you've considered. So the first bit is about plastic being dumped in the ocean, and lots of you might have seen on TV some of the documentaries that have been published and created recently about this. So we might discuss how humans have an impact on our environment, how plastic in the ocean damages wildlife. So that's one thing we might discuss. We also might discuss just how widely spread plastic is used and what we could do to reduce the amount of plastic we use. For instance, reusable water bottles, or trying to ensure that we sort of buy less things with plastic packaging, or go to shops where we can refill goods without having to buy yet more plastic. And then there's something like rainforests being destroyed. So that's quite an interesting thing. Um, that might lead you to discuss how important it is that trees are planted. You might say, well, sure, sometimes trees have to be cut down for materials, but we could always plant more trees and that would help. Some of you may wish to discuss why rainforests are being cut down. And I think a lot of people don't really understand that often rainforests are cut down for things like um, to give the land over to growing other crops or to give the land over to farming, such as cattle farming. So maybe if we care about the rainforest, we should think about some of our dietary habits. And then we've got this idea about using less, recycling more, and taking better care of the environment. That's obviously quite broad. You might focus on using less and thinking about the stuff we tend to throw away. Is this a throwaway culture? Do we tend to throw things away instead of fixing them? Is it become normal just to sort of constantly want to replace your clothes, your trainers, or the things you have at home? And also, taking better care of the environment could even lead you to discuss things like pollution, the public transport, burning of fossil fuels, and the way we get our energy. So this is a really broad question, which could lead you to discuss whatever you find most interesting. Remember, you have to, out of this big statement, pick the things that you really want to focus on and the things you'd like to argue in your letter to the politician. So here's a planning structure which I think you could try and use. It asks you to make 5 points, which could be 5 paragraphs. So you're only talking sort of a page and a half or 2 pages of writing. This is a 45-minute task, really. So if you spent 5 or 10 minutes thinking and planning, and you know you've got to spend some time at the end proofreading and checking your writing, you're really only going to be writing for 35 minutes or so. So my 5-step plan for you is this. In your introduction, you try and establish a relationship with the audience. You think about how you're going to engage your audience. Then in your second point, you say what you think the big problem is here. So problem our culture and the way we use too much? Is the problem the lack of education that people have about the environment? I don't know. And then there's the false solution. So this might be something that a lot of people think is important, but you believe is not. Or some people think that the problem would be solved if we all did this, but they're wrong, and here's why they're wrong. For instance, some people think that if we just recycle, that's enough, but they're wrong because of these reasons. And finally, the final sort of section of your argument before you conclude is the real solution. What actually needs to happen for the problem to be fixed? And that could be a sort of combination of ideas. What are the most important things that need to happen in order for this environmental problem to be solved? And finally, a conclusion. You might go back to something you mentioned in introduction. You might sort of answer a question you raised earlier, but you need to think about the final thing you're going to leave your audience with. What is the way forward? What do you urge them to do? So the devices that are in your booklet for this week, I'm just going to briefly talk through them. Firstly, ethos. That's one of the three pillars of rhetoric. We talked in class about ethos, logos, and pathos. Pathos being emotion, logos being logic and reasoning, and ethos being more about your character and your credibility. So for this task, when you're writing to a politician, absolutely just be a concerned teenager with who's seen the way that other people behave and it's angered you and it's something you feel passionate about, and that is a credible voice. So provided you pick someone uh, to sort of write to this politician as, and you keep it consistent, you will be providing strong ethos and a credible voice. Secondly, anaphora. This is repeating the same word or phrase at the start of a succession of clauses or sentences. Um, some examples, you might pause this video and maybe try and write a couple, add them to your plan before you start writing. So you can see my three examples there on the slide that you could use to start 3 or 4 or 2 sentences or clauses in a longer sentence. Number 3, just a reminder of your useful vocabulary list, and I've copied and pasted it here just in case you don't have your booklet. So it's just important to vary our vocabulary when we're making an argument. And then, if something is important, there's a variety of words you could use. And if you're suggesting an idea that works, you can say it's promising, beneficial, groundbreaking, etc. Things that don't work and negative emotional responses will help you argue against other opinions that you don't agree with. And finally, hypophora is quite a complex word for what is actually quite a simple and effective device. You raise the question and you answer it directly afterwards. And I think often this works very well when you've got a slightly longer question and quite a short statement or sentence answering after. So again, maybe pause the video, try write your own example, add it to your plan before you start writing. So by now I hope you've got a good plan in mind, you've experimented with some of those devices, and I've just got some sentences here which you could use or edit, adapt for your own letter. Thinking about who you're writing to, you're writing to a politician, they've been elected to represent us as a country. So you can say things like, I'd like to thank you on your work on this project. However, now I think we really need to focus on the environment. You can start in many, many ways, and there's some examples there. If you're writing a letter, don't forget your salutation. So you can say, "Dear Sir," "Dear Madam," and there'd be nothing wrong with you making up a name for your politician. "Dear Mrs. Khalid," "Dear Doctor so and so," whatever you want, really. Okay, good luck.